So you're listing cards the other day, and you come across a revised Farmstead. You look it up, and it's a $7 card, when there are clearly better options. What the f***? Welcome back to MTG Money. I'm Matt, your host and owner of EC Hipstar Games in a once again wintry Eau Claire, Wisconsin. I've been meaning to cover this for a little bit now, and I feel like this is especially timely with the third round of stimulus checks coming out, tax return season coming right up, which is typically a boom time for Magic singles prices, and reserve list prices that have been spiking since the pandemic began. Before we dive in, if you like this video and my other ones, please go ahead, like, subscribe, and comment on the video, and hopefully we can bring some of the information to a wider audience. Now, without further ado, let's take a look at what is going on with the prices of reserved list cards, why no one should be paying these prices, and especially not for the bad cards. To do this, we're going to take a look at a simple supply and demand graph from your college microeconomics class, and what we're looking at is to see what happens when the supply shifts to the left on the graph, and this is essentially what's happened with the decreased supply in cards with the shutdown of in-person play. I mentioned this before, but it's especially noticeable from the Magic Fest, which is where a lot of vendors stop in with a lot of money on what is essentially a traveling circuit and spend possibly millions in a weekend buying cards from players in that city and the surrounding area, and then injecting those cards into the market via TCG Player, eBay, or their own stores. As you can tell by the graph, what this does is it scales back supply, which ends up raising the price if demand stays the same. However, this is a bit of a cyclical effect when this is essentially what's happening when you hear of FOMO, or fear of missing out, which is that as the price goes up, you have some group who says, I need to get in on this before the price goes up higher. That increases demand. Supply is, in this case, even still dwindling as more copies go out of the market, and it keeps pushing that price up until there's a new equilibrium between that reduced supply and what people are willing to pay for those cards. Now, I think it's important to kind of listen to the counter arguments for some of these. Some people are saying that the increased prices on reserved list cards are due to the increased money supply that has been injected into the economy through the stimulus checks and other means. However, if you keep track of these things, so far they've only injected about 40%. They've only increased the money supply by about 40%. So, using that logic, we should be able to somewhat figure that the prices of these assets, in this case cards, should only be up about 40% from what they typically are. There's another argument that says because it's free money, it's pushing the prices of some of these collectibles up, as people are more willing to spend it on what could be meaningless things versus buying essentials or investing in something like stocks. There's also the idea that as the stock market continues to climb, people are looking for alternative investments, and that's why we see some of these card prices going up. One thing to take a look at, though, is some of those ideas might hold weight for some of the top-tier cards. Think your Power 9, your Dual Lands. It almost assuredly does not hold weight for these bad reserved list cards, which honestly is everything that doesn't see play. I used Farmstead in the intro there because, as you could see from that, there are two clearly better cards that have been printed more recently and are in higher supply. The only reason that we can assume Farmstead is at the price that it's at is due to the scarcity of it being on the reserve list and not having been reprinted since revised. Now, a lot of these reserve list cards have seen spikes like this before. Coming back to about 2018, we saw a similar spike, just not quite to the heights that we're seeing now. And to kind of emphasize that and get an idea of what might happen to a lot of these bad reserved list cards, we're going to take a look at Koskin Falls. Okay, so first off, we're going to take a look at what Koskin Falls does. It's 2 black, 2 colorless, and during your upkeep you tap, target untapped creature you control, or bury it. And no creature can attack you unless its controller pays an additional 2 whenever that creature attacks. Not worthless, not nearly as bad as Farmstead, but again, not something that should be commanding a $20 price tag. Let's go ahead and just look at historically where this card has been. You can see it's riding under $1 all the way up into mid-2016, and that's when we see our first spike here. And that got it up to about $2.53. And then we see the spike in 2018, which was a pretty wide spike for almost all reserved list cards. And this is widely thought to have been because people were pulling money out of crypto at the time. But what's more interesting here is let's look at what happened after that. It spiked up to about $7, $8 or so at that time. And after that, it does a slow and steady fall all the way back down to 3 or 4 until the pandemic starts and we can see the spike, it drops again, and then we have another spike. Something similar to the Koskin Falls example from a couple of years ago, where it spiked and then lost about 50%, should happen to most of the reserve list cards. I even think it's going to happen to the Power 9 and Dual Lands. Percentage-wise, I expect the Power 9 and Dual Lands to lose the least. However, they are most likely going to lose the most in pure dollar terms because they've got more value to start with. Now, if you've already bought in, I've got both good and bad news. The good news is that these will almost certainly spike again unless Wizards would reprint cards off the reserve list. And when they do spike again, they're going to go up even higher. As you can see from that Koskin Falls example, that 2018 spike pales in comparison to the 2 recent spikes we've had because of the pandemic. And that's because when players buy at a certain price, maybe somebody got in at 10 on Koskin Falls, they don't want to sell for below that. So a lot of these cards are going to sit in binders, and the next time it goes up, that's going to be less cards in dealers' inventory for players looking to get in on it then to buy out. So it's going to spike even harder than it did this time. The bad news is that we obviously don't know when that next spike is going to come. But at some point, something is going to drive the whole reserve list to spike up again, which will give you another chance to get out on these if it's something you've already bought in on, or if it's something you want to spend money on now. Keep in mind, though, they are at historic highs, so now is probably the worst time to be spending money on them in the near future. If you haven't bought in yet, but you do want to get in on some of these reserved list cards, I would suggest waiting until in-store play resumes, and obviously the Magic Fest play. When vendors can go ahead and restock their supply, we should see prices dip. It's most likely going to happen like it did with that previous spike, where it's going to be a slow drop over the next couple of years. However, this does represent a great time to get in on these cards if it's something you're looking to purchase. Or better yet, just don't buy the bad reserve list cards. Instead, save your money for the playable reserve list cards and try to invest all in on those, because at least then you've got some playability driving the price. That wraps up my thoughts on the reserve list, bad cards on the reserve list, and some idea of what prices might do once in-store play resumes. So I just want to thank you for watching. Again, if you liked the video, please like, subscribe, and share it, and I will see you next time on MTG Money.